Yes, we are recording. Brilliant. So hello and welcome to another one of our Winter Warmer talks. We'll be delivering this series of talks throughout the winter months, seeing us right into the spring. My name's Laura Ashfield and I am the Community Learning Officer for the Royal Parks, and we are the charity that looks after London's 8 royal parks, which are Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, St James's Park, the Green Park, Regent's Park and Primrose Hill, Bushy Park, Greenwich Park and Richmond Park. We also help to look after Brompton Cemetery, which we're going to hear a little bit about tonight, and Victoria Tower Gardens. And we look after the parks and ensure that they're accessible for everyone to benefit from the health and well-being benefits of being able to access the parks. We also look after the parks for the benefit of wildlife and biodiversity within the parks, and also obviously to preserve the rich cultural heritage that the parks have to offer as well. And tonight I'm very excited to introduce Sheldon Goodman. Sheldon is a cemetery and queer historian who has run the Cemetery Club for the past 8 years. He is passionate about making history accessible to everyone and to highlight the fact that cemeteries are museums of people. So without further ado, Sheldon, I'm going to hand over to you. But you're very welcome, everyone. Do feel free to put questions in the chat. And yeah, welcome, Sheldon. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for such a warm welcome. So this is basically the online talk looking at tales from the catacombs. So I dare say a fair number of you probably saw my online video series that I did in November, which dealt with looking at those buried in a part of Brompton Cemetery that isn't open very often. In fact, it's very rarely open at all. I think even only the Friends have access to only one of the vaults. Whereas the Royal Parks very kindly, because it was Halloween and because, of course, that time of year, they very kindly gave me special access to all the vaults in their entirety, which was quite the privilege. So as Laura said on the introduction, I am a cemetery and death historian, particularly queer history as well. And I love cemeteries. I don't see them as spooky places. I see them as fantastic.
How do I get the pin in? Drop that box down. There's obviously something going on behind.
Oh,
not seeing.
Make sure you're muted, please. Make sure you're muted. So I see cemeteries as museums of people, and they are cultural resources where you can learn so much. And one of the things I love about cemeteries is the fact that they don't give you the answers all in one go. For example, if you take a headstone, it doesn't actually tell you anything particularly useful about the person. Yes, it says their name. Yes, it says their date of birth and death, and perhaps a biblical passage. But what about their favourite colour? Well, did they ever go to New York? Had they ever tried Indian cuisine? Had they ever been to Scotland? Those kind of questions, which I find far more interesting, is the stuff that's actually missing, and that's the kind of stuff I want to find out about. I want to know who they fell in love with, who they had dalliances with, who they were gossiping about, and that kind of stuff. And so, particularly when I came to the Royal Parks with this particular project, when I said, who is in your catacombs? Because if you've ever visited Brompton Cemetery, if you've been lucky enough to live nearby, you'll know it is a beautifully manicured parkland. And the central area, which is referred to as the open-air cathedral, takes direct inspiration from the Basilica and the Vatican City in Rome. It was very much created with that kind of architecture particularly in mind. And those colonnades themselves are very, very well known in terms of the history of the cemetery, particularly in the queer community. In the 1980s, they had another use. Not that I'm going to be talking about that tonight. But those colonnades served a function. Yes, they're a lovely place to process. Yes, they're a lovely place to take a stroll. But their original intention was to be a shelter for the monuments to the various catacombs, to the various coffins that were in the catacombs beneath that particular structure. Now, it's a magnificent structure. If you're lucky enough to have been to Brompton, or if you're intending on going, there aren't many memorials in those colonnades today. Sadly, it's a Victorian cemetery. After a period of kind of letting things go a little bit in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of the monuments were smashed up and destroyed, although a number of them have actually been stored away for safekeeping in the vicinity of the park, but they aren't actually being displayed in the way that they were supposed to be. So the catacombs beneath, you never get a full sense of who's there, what they're like. For most people, particularly for mourners, particularly when the Brompton Cemetery was operational in its heyday, the closest they could get was walking these colonnades and looking at these lovely wall-banked memorials that you kind of see in churches, and well, it's the same kind of thing, to to the memory of Sophie Clark, who died in 1859, with a beautiful Italian marble carved sculpture representing the life that's been stored away beneath. Now, particularly when it comes to the catacombs, whenever I go and pay a visit to Brompton, people are always peering through the gates. They always, it's a fascinating part of the cemetery. As I said, it's not open very often, and people are fascinated by what's behind those particular gates. So one of the surprising things that people get taken aback by when they look at this particular structure above ground is that the catacombs themselves don't necessarily follow this particular plan you see here. If you think the catacombs are beneath those colonnades, you think, oh, they must be pretty big. They must be quite expansive. No, there's a slight deception going on. So this is a map of the cemetery that was done in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I believe. And it's basically an architectural plan of the cemetery. And there in this centre, you can see that central bit. You've got the great circle there. You've got the kind of like nave coming down to just going off to the left. You've got a little bit heading off towards the chapel. What, in terms of actual catacombs that are underneath those colonnades, it's actually quite limited. So you've got, and also what's important to know about Brompton Cemetery's catacombs is that they aren't all treated as one. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Victorians loved having hierarchy in death. And yes, the catacombs were slightly more above what most people were kind of, certainly what most people could afford. But this, in terms of the exclusivity of the people who are actually buried in these particular catacombs, there aren't any poor people. It was exclusively a place where the rich chose to be buried. Perhaps they didn't want to fork out for their own mausoleum, or perhaps they kind of wanted a slightly more European style way of being interred once they passed away. But what you see here with the red highlights is actually the extent of the catacombs in Brompton Cemetery. So in terms of the social scale, you've got the West Catacombs, which once, not now, but once ran the whole western edge of the cemetery. And at one point along its run was something else called the Public Vault. Now, there's a slight kind of discrepancy as to what the difference was between the two. The West Catacombs were, funnily enough, catacombs, but it was very much for the middle and upper middle classes. So, people who were comfortably well off, they might not have been the richest people on the planet, but they certainly had enough to have a burial that was slightly more prestigious than a regular grave burial. And then there was the Public Vault, which was kind of used, from what I can understand, from how I've gone through the records in the archives, as something like temporary storage. A lot of people who were put into the Public Vault either got moved into other catacombs, a couple moved into the Great Circle catacombs, another couple got shipped out entirely. Because, of course, when people were placed in catacombs, it didn't necessarily mean that that's where they would stay forever. A number of them were shipped off to America, some were shipped off to other cemeteries, some were moved when the family moved away at some point, 15, 20 years after death initially. So the Public Vault was kind of like a holding cell, essentially. But that's not to say that coffins in the other parts didn't move around as well. So you have the West Catacombs, you have the Public Vault, and then you have a step up. You've then got the Bell Tower Catacombs. So just going back to my previous photo here, you can just see on the right-hand side, you've got the Bell Tower. There's supposed to be two, but they ran out of money. They only could afford to actually build one in the end. But that part of the catacombs are known as the Bell Tower Catacombs. And they're only 3 vaults. So you've got that central tower where the central catacomb is, and then either side, that arch either side, that's the extent of those kind of particular catacombs. So they're not very big, but again, they were kind of the next step up in terms of social scale. And then you've got basically the Belgravia of the cemetery, essentially, and that's the Great Circle Catacombs. Now, again, you would have thought it would actually be a circle, a complete circle of catacombs, but I think what happened is that as the cemetery opened in 1840 and the catacombs received their first burial in 1841, demand wasn't that severe, really. I think there's certainly room for several thousand people that could have actually gone into the catacombs in the end, but literally the most that ever went in any one year was, I think, in 1863, where there was 15 people. That was it. It was not a barnstorming success. In fact, it was a bit of a financial failure. And for some of you who might be aware of the history of the cemetery, finances were not the cemetery's strong point, and I'll get to that as the talk progresses. But I think at one point the original plan was to actually have all these catacombs interconnected, particularly in the Great Circle and the Bell Tower Catacombs. But because no one was really buying them, they literally just shut the vaults off. So those pink bits you can see are the only accessible bits. You look at the brickwork, you can actually see like examples of where was once an archway. They've bricked it up because they just know it's not going to ever get used. So, but in terms of like catacombs themselves, so this is the Brompton Catacombs. Where does it come from? I mean, the actual word itself is probably derived from Latin. It's a Latin phrase called catacombus, and it comes from probably a saying called among the tombs. And there were catacombs in Rome, in ancient Rome, where the dead were forbidden from being buried amongst the living. They were buried outside the city limits, preferably underground, obviously to shelter them from interference, from vermin and so on. And they became an integral part of dealing with the Roman dead. And catacombs have been used throughout many different cultures throughout the years. Notably, another good example, obviously, is the Parisian catacombs, which were a very, very different prospect to the Brompton catacombs, where it came from the fact that in the early 19th century, Parisian churchyards were overflowing. They certainly were by the end of the 18th century. And a number of them were emptied into old abandoned mines underneath the city of Paris. And it took about 2 years to fully empty these kind of old full churchyards. And there's stories of cartloads of bone and all kinds of other remains being taken and being stacked in that particular way with which they are actually done in Paris. Now, obviously, as I said, Brompton is not like that at all. It's a far more dignified affair. And when Brompton opened as a result of the need to change how burial practices happened in the 1830s. The form of catacomb burial was primarily started by Kensal Green Cemetery, which has a very extensive network underneath its main chapel, if you've ever been. Highgate Cemetery, the best known one, for example, has got several different tiers of catacombs. You've got the Egyptian Circle, which used to have a big old cedar of Lebanon tree in the middle of it. That's now long since gone, sadly, but it's been replaced by a little Diddy version. You've got the vaults at the back of the cemetery, and you've also got the private mausolea and stuff as well. So Brompton was trying to keep up with these other cemeteries with which it found itself in direct competition to, because they weren't all kind of like sister branches. They were rival companies. And so when you look at the operation of Brompton particularly, Brompton was kind of like hobnobbing against the likes of Kensal Green and so on. And usually speaking, going on the charges that were levied when the cemetery opened, there's a very actually useful historical book which was published by a guy called John Corch in 1840. And essentially, it was the Yellow Pages of Death. This guy lived in Mile End. I think he was a publisher. Went to all these various burial grounds and said, right, how much do these how much does it cost to bury someone? Let's say I want to put my Auntie Enid into a catacomb. How much? And he compiled this book, a death Wikipedia essentially, for people to use for those who happened to die in the 1840s. And Brompton Cemetery was one of the places that he visited. And at that point, it cost about £14 if you wanted to put someone into a catacomb. Now, just for inflation, that's roughly about £1,200 today. And then obviously you wanted two coffins that would rise up to nearly £2,000 in today's money, and so on. Now, Brompton wasn't the most expensive, but by and large, most cemeteries charge roughly £14, £15 for a coffin to go into the catacomb. And this was there's a whole like series of books that actually of charges even that tell you how much was being kind of levied against burying your dearly departed. So, for example, on the map that we've got here, we've got the Great Circle, Bell Tower, West Catacombs. So if you wanted to put someone in the Western Catacomb, that was £12, slightly cheaper, again, slightly more within the range of the middle classes, upper middle classes. That's roughly about just over £1,000. Bell Tower was £14. That's £1,458. And then the Great Circle Catacombs, the best spot of all, £15, which is roughly about £1,562. And if you wanted to go into the public vaults, it was £416. So quite a bit cheaper, when really there wasn't actually that much difference between them structurally. So, but again, they liked having their hierarchy and stuff as well. I mean, compare as well when the cemetery opened to churches who used to give out space in their crypts. So there's St. Luke's Church in Chelsea, for example, round about the same time in the same book, they charged £10 for a coffin to go into its catacombs, which is roughly about well, just under £1,000, I think, roughly, give or take. So yeah, so that's the kind of world with which Brompton opens up its vaults. And between 1840 and 1915, the catacombs are open to receive the remains of the dead. Now, I say 1840 to 1915. Something happens in between where basically it goes into semi-retirement. But again, I'll get to that point as we kind of get to it. But that's the kind of period with which this has been part of the cemetery. It has not been an active part of the cemetery for a very, very, very long time. If you go through the minute books of the cemetery, you can see records of having daily inspections, which very quickly become monthly inspections, which then very quickly become whenever we feel like it. And that's because it's just not used. No one really uses it. So it's not been active for a very, very, very long time. So if you wanted to find out about who was buried in the catacombs, there's no easy way to do it, really. It's not as if you can go onto the Royal Parks website and go, right, catacomb burials, give me everything that you've got. It's mainly done by name. If you know someone who might be in, you find that particular like entry, and there you go. There's no one thing on the website which tells you how many are in there and where exactly they are within those various different vaults of which can be found in the cemetery. So that's where I came into it. When I started doing this video project, I wanted to kind of sort that out. So the Royal Parks very kindly shared with me a spreadsheet. Now, I've not dealt with a spreadsheet since I was about 15, so this has been a hell of a learning curve for me, where I was cross-referencing all the records with the information that the cemetery had, and trying to get a database together where we could get useful information from. What's the gender split? What's the rough age range of people that have been placed there? What areas did they come from? That kind of stuff, which you won't get when you just do this cursory search on the Royal Parks website. Now, you can also access these records through Ancestry UK as well. So there's various kind of ways that you can do it and stuff. But that's basically, this is where we start the journey from. This is how I started doing the research for the various videos that I did. So moving on, this is the kind of spreadsheet that I'm kind of working my way through at the moment. So this is kind of like the tail end of the catacombs as it is. Now you see that there's a big old line there saying catacombs closed. And again, I'll get to that later on. But from 1890 onwards, the catacombs basically don't really take anyone unless someone has an existing right to be purchased there. Again, I'll go on to that in a little bit more. But this is the kind of level of detail that I'm putting together to make the histories that are in these catacombs more accessible. So if people want to research them, they can knock themselves out. They know where they are. They know where the person died. They know the age they were when they died. They know the location, which is far more visible than the histories that are currently there at this current time, as we know. So from here, so this is when I started going down to the catacombs to see who exactly was there. The first port of call was to go to the cemetery office, managed very, very astutely by Charlie, looking at the old maps. Now, this is a schematic for the southwest quarter. So basically, just imagine this plan, but kind of quadrupled for the Great Circle. Although for two of the vaults on the left-hand side, see those stairs? For the northeast and the northwest ones, there's only that central vault and then the vaults either side. Those kind of like, there's a Pokemon that looks like that. There's the arms at the side don't exist for the other vaults. But what this was is that basically this was a point for the cemetery administrator to actually input the burial number. So whenever anyone was entered into the book of burial, they were given a number saying the number that they were of being interred in the cemetery. And then they would be put in you see, it looks like fence panels above. The number of the burial record was supposed to be written in those things to tell you where the coffins were. So if let's say in the future, a historian decides to do a video series on YouTube about your history, you'd consult this and find out who was where to make their life easier. Sadly, this was not followed. This plan was, again, with all kind of like best made plans and so on, they started and then they never bothered with it. And there's various reasons for that. Basically, keeping the cemetery going administratively was a Herculean task, because if they had spreadsheets, the problem would be an issue. But they had to duplicate and triplicate various entries, and frankly, I think it was just far too much for them to keep up a handle on. So occasionally, and you might be able to just see a couple of numbers have been entered into the various fence panels, into the various kind of slots and stuff. But by and large, all we've got is the data that's been extracted from a digitization project that happened decades ago. And then it's obviously just dealing with that to get the information that we need. Now, that's no straightforward task. There was a couple of issues, but I'll mention that later on. But going through that spreadsheet and actually going around and seeing the coffins on the shelves, who is actually there? What can we actually work out? Well, this is pie chart time. I think we're probably more used to Chris Whitty doing this kind of stuff than me, so apologies. So this is everyone from I can ascertain who is actually in the catacombs. So this is a breakdown of the male and female split. So it's 53.4% male and 46.6% female. Now, this is a kind of like a work in progress. I'm sure the statistics could probably be slightly tweaked because there were 597 coffins placed here. Not all 597 remain, and there's various reasons as to why that is. Some of them moved off to, as I said, to America, to other cemeteries. Others, we don't know what happened to them. Over the years, particularly the Western Catacomb got bombed. Various, obviously, you know what happens when a bomb goes off, and so whatever was left was quietly buried elsewhere on site. So in terms of this statistic, this is technically how many there should be, but that gives you a rough number. 597 is actually quite low, considering how many vaults and spaces there were in the archives and the colonnades beneath. So it's quite interesting to see it kind of represented like this. So that's a kind of like a brief introduction as to who's there and so on. But my interest, particularly with this particular thing, is that obviously this is a history that is not very commonly seen or granted access to, and knowing that going down those steps into these catacombs, I'm literally treading and walking in the steps of history. For example, when Frederick Clay, one of the people did the video on, his funeral saw the likes of Gilbert and Sullivan, probably the greatest musical pairing of the 19th century, walk that same route I did and go to his exact loculi to see his coffin being placed in the family vault. And knowing that I will never meet those people, but knowing that I follow them historically in that way, I just find absolutely intoxicating. I love it. And the amount of people, the rich and famous who have walked that very journey to give their blessing to Auntie Enid or Uncle John or whoever happens to be buried there, I find absolutely astounding. So I'm going to give you a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of who I found in the catacombs who I didn't have time to make a video about first off, but also who are interesting to me. And hopefully some of these names, I invite you, go off and see what you can find. Get your notebooks out, for goodness sake. These are people whose names haven't been uttered in decades, if not probably centuries. So by all means, use this as a starting off point. Use this to get actually involved and find out about the people who are behind those locked gates first and foremost. So let's get started.
Now, to get into the catacombs, you have to go through gates such as this, and they are covered in Victorian symbology. The Victorians loved putting symbols on their tombs and headstones. And here you see an upturned torch, which represents a life extinguished. The snake represents life. The snake eating its tail, also known as an Ouroboros circle, represents life. And then you've got the winged hourglass, which represents the fleeting passage of time.
Right. So we step through the gates and we come through and we're confronted with the coffins themselves. Now, it's quite jarring. A lot of people we're all, I'd say, probably on the same page where we go, we're fascinated by that. We see these people. But when you open up the gates, you don't see the relationships. You don't see the way that these people would have interacted with each other in life. We see names, we see, weathered bronze plaques, we see bars in front of them. We don't see the relationships that these people had with each other. So for this I'm going to use the northwestern vault as an example. So open up the gates. This is just a solitary vault, as I said. The other wings have been bricked up. This is all that was ever used. And you see the names. You see the likes of James Boot. You see the name of Francis Milman. You see Francis Hallam Codd. Okay, did they know each other? Why are they all here? Were they friends? Were they neighbours? How does it work? So yesterday I went down to double check because, and again, the heading for this one is the trouble with 19th century administrators. So again, using this as a particular example, going into the records, each of these those coffins are supposed to correspond to a location. So let me just show you the next slide. So each shelf is called a tier, and there are 7 tiers. Tier 1 is just off the image there. You can just about see it, and then tier 7 is essentially the ground floor, or the floor level. And then going along, you've got compartments. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So by this kind of recollection, Francis Hallam Codd should be Northwest Vault, tier 5, compartment 1. James Boot should be Northwest Vault, tier 4, compartment 3. Do the records follow this logic? No, they don't. No, they don't at all. They're all over the flipping shop. It's a ruddy mess, frankly, because although this was the dedicated plan to help locate where people were, I think when a lot of these coffins were placed, they did have name plaques on, and the administrator clearly thought, "Oh, blow it! It doesn't matter. We'll just put them in, and have that, and what have you." And so nowadays, with the plaques being weathered, the fact that the records are all over the shop, identifying who these people are is all the more difficult. So this is who I've worked out in this particular shop that I've worked out thus far, and there are some relations here. So we've got so we've got Joseph Strother and Mary Strother. Joseph was a coal merchant and collector of what? We don't know. Mary was his wife. Why exactly there's a bell on their coffin thing, and why there's a bird's nest, Lord knows. We've got Maria Millman and Francis Millman. I think Francis Millman was some sort of soldier. Frances Hallam Codd, she died in the late 1860s, I believe, and she was a house furnisher. So she would go around and she would actually furnish people's houses before they sold them on. So you can imagine her on like, I don't know, like Grand Designs or something if she was alive in the 21st century. So so she was the daughter of a lieutenant colonel, I believe. And again, obviously as a result of that, when she eventually passed at a very early age, I think she's only in her early 30s, she was put in this very prestigious part of Brompton Cemetery. But there's also another person here that I want to briefly mention because, again, it's a family link. You'll see that a number of them have the same surname. So at the top, you've got Matilda Seguier, you've got William Seguier on tier 3, and then down on tier 6, you've got Anne Seguier. This is a family. William Seguier was married to Anne Seguier, who's on tier 6, and Matilda Seguier is their daughter. Now, why they aren't all together, Lord knows. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that Anne died first. She died in the 1850s. No, sorry. William died first, but Anne was the first one to be placed into the vault. William died in 1843, and he was put into the vault of St. Luke's, Chelsea. Now, in the end of the 1850s, St. Luke's had its vault cleared out, and they were taken, all the coffins, all the bodies were taken en masse to Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. But families were given the option of being able to take their dearly departed and to be reburied elsewhere. They obviously wanted him to have his own private place of burial. They didn't want him to be shipped off to the, to the wilds of Surrey in a communal grave. So he was placed there. Now, William himself is a very fascinating chap because he was instrumental in the art world in the 1820s and 1830s, and he was also the first superintendent of the National Gallery. So if there's any museum folk who've dialed in, this man is hellishly important. He was descended from French Huguenots, and he trained as an artist himself and became a bit of a connoisseur in restoring and framing pictures. And to this end, he became very good friends with King George IV and Sir Robert Peel, as well as the Duke of Wellington. So he became an established figure, and he was the first superintendent of a museum that's long since gone, called the British Institution. And it was very much the art gallery museum exhibition space to go to in the early Victorian period. And it used to display old masters' paintings very regularly. And then and he oversaw that and kind of had a very fine standing. And then in 1824, he was made the first superintendent of the National Gallery, and he held this post until his death in 1843. Now, not everyone was a fan of the way that he advised on art, displayed art, kind of gave opinions on it. For example, the painter John Constable thought he was a bit of an idiot, frankly. He thought he was a bit of a bore. And this was a sentiment that was shared by a number of other people in society at the time who basically said he's incompetent and doesn't know what on earth he's doing. He's just somehow got into these positions of power because he knows whose backs to rub, which to a certain extent is largely true. And this is a man who thought the extent of a good painting was how brown it was. And he said the perfect colour of a painting is the same colour as a violin. I mean, not sure that works in a landscape, but whatever. But his coffin was moved here in the 1850s, and the various family members decided to get added to that vault in the years afterwards. Interestingly enough, as well, maybe burial changed, but obviously family members kept on being born, and they also kept on dying. His grandson, Henry Seguier Brown, I think his name was, inherited his grandfather's collection of autographs from painters and illustrators such as George Cruikshank and Benjamin West and David Wilkie. And he collated them into a book, which he then bequeathed to, I think, the University of Cambridge. If you look it up on Google, it comes up. But his grandson, obviously, he didn't fancy wanting to go into the catacomb himself. So what he did is that he got a plot literally just next door to the opening of the catacomb itself. So that's that kind of wonky little headstone. The cross has long since fallen off, is the grandson's grave with a couple of other family members, whereas his granddad, his grandmother, and his aunt are in that vault beneath. So again, keeping it close, keeping it, even though tastes might change, people still want to be close to each other even in death. So another one I'm looking into at the moment, and again, this is just to show you that a lot of the histories that we're dealing with aren't particularly, how do I describe this? It's not it's history we should acknowledge and we should know, but it's also linked to slightly contentious history as well. And there's a fair number of military men in the catacombs of Brompton Cemetery. And again, I could bore you all with Sir Chancellery Fardydar, whatever his name is. But one of the people who's buried not in this vault, he's buried in the southwest vault, the bigger of the catacomb vaults, is a guy called William Gustavus Brown. And I found it because next to William, there's Henry Brown, and I thought that this was his dad. And this is why you should always double check your work. It's not. Someone on Ancestry got their kind of details wrong. But anyway, I found out about this guy who is, that's the one I was looking at, who's presented thusly. Now, the interesting thing about William Gustavus Brown is that ethnically he is quite interesting because he was the third eldest son of Gustav Heinrich Gottlieb Braun, who was a Prussian military officer. And this is also where it gets very interesting because his father had a relationship with a woman and eventually married a woman called Janet Smalley, who was a woman in Jamaica who on her marriage certificate is listed as a freed quadroon, which is very interesting. A quadroon is an archaic term for someone of mixed race heritage. The official dictionary definition is 3/4 white, 1/4 black. So one of her grandparents was black. And she was listed as a freed slave, so she was clearly enslaved at one point and then freed, probably not long after the emancipation, I would guess. I still need to look into it. But as a result of this, William was very much a child of the empire. Even though he was mixed race himself, this didn't seem to have impeded his military prowess or respect in the fields. No one kind of, seemed to be racial to him, although outwardly he did present as a white Victorian male, but his makeup obviously suggests otherwise. And he served in the 24th Regiment of the Foot, which is an old infantry regiment that saw him participate in battles in India, particularly, such as Punjab, Gujarat, and Chillinwalla. Now, Chillinwalla, I didn't know. I thought, I'm being half Asian myself. I was like, okay, so what kind of battle is this? Obviously, I'm familiar with the Indian Uprising of 1857. In my other tour in Tower Hamlets Cemetery, there's a guy I talk about at great lengths who was there at the Siege of Delhi, just as things were really hotting up in terms of the nastiness, or worse than nastiness, between India and Britain. But the Battle of Chillinwalla was one of the pre-skirmishes to the events that led up to the Indian Uprising. And it happened in January 1849 as part of the Second Anglo-Sikh War. And it was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought by the British East India Company, the private company that essentially ran India on behalf of the British government. Both sides massacred each other, but the Sikhs, who the British were fighting, both sides proclaimed victory, but the Sikhs basically surprised the British with their military prowess. And the Brits went a bit, ooh, we better watch these because they've got teeth. They know how to defend each other. This is quite interesting. And during that battle, which again was horrific, the 24th Regiment of the Foot suffered a near 50% casualty rate. It is very lucky that William survived at all. It was a bloodbath of the worst thing. News got back to Britain about how appalling it was. But again, events led on, and then of course a couple of years later, the Indian Uprising happened. But William actually comes to some prominence himself, particularly in the 1860s, when he's given charge of armed forces in China. And there he's actually reported in the newspapers in 1863 during an uprising that happened in the Taizan in China, where allegations were levied against him for brutality against Chinese prisoners. Now, again, the kind of British presence in China in the 1860s is worth a talk of itself. I find it very hard to condense down into one thing. But he writes to the London Gazette and basically goes, "I'm not mistreating anyone, thank you very much. I'm treating things with gusto and reserve. So I'll gladly thank you kindly, not to besmirch my name in public. Thank you very much." Whether maybe he was, treating the prisoners with respect, but who knows? I don't know. Again, he saw some appalling military action. And again, I find him a very fascinating character because of his ethnicity and genetic background. So again, I invite people to look him up. He's a fascinating chap, particularly when we nowadays are really kind of re-examining our history in empire. And again, my interest as well, particularly when it comes to the history of India and so on. And just going on from that as well, there's two, if there's homework from tonight, seeing if you're wanting something to do, two names for you to research as well who are placed in the Catacombs of Brompton. Sir William Kay and John Gage. Get a pen and paper, write those names down. So I'll be interested to see what you find out. Some of you might be familiar with that logo there. That is the logo that's used with the UCL Slavery Index. That basically tells you everything you need to know about these two men. They are in the Catacombs, and I'm certainly not saying that we should forget these people. We certainly shouldn't celebrate the history with which they were a part of either, but we should know about this history, and we should know, particularly in cemeteries, how these people interacted with each other. Because again, a lot of the people buried in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s did have links to this very, very dark part of our past, and we should absolutely know these names, know what they did to help us kind of reappraise these histories as we kind of get to grips with the legacies of it in the 21st century. So do have a look at those names as well. Fascinating, fascinating men. Oh, hello. Another one I'm going to talk about is Sophie Viscountess Dugganow. Now, in the photo here, this is the southwest vault again. So this is the same vault that Gustavus Brown's in. Sophie is one of these coffins. I don't know which one. Certainly not the ones at my kind of like my chest level. But Sophie is remarkable in the fact that she was photographed by Camille Sylvie, who was a French photographer of some considerable repute, who photographed the great and the good of Victorian society in the 1860s. If you go onto the National Portrait Gallery website, you can see his day books, where day by day, it's literally just his journal of who he's photographed that day. Fascinating historical insight into fashion, into who's who, how photos were composed. It's a wonderful resource. But Sophie was the wife of Arthur Dugganow, the third Viscount Dugganow, and she was originally born in a town in Ireland, now present-day Northern Ireland, and she was something of a woman with exquisite fine taste. And by that I mean is the fact that periodically her belongings pop up in online auction rooms. And to give you a sense of, and there, she's presented us there as a very prim and proper Victorian lady. But I found on the Sotheby website a clock she once owned. Now, this clock was made way before she was even born, about a century before she was born. But this particular clock itself was made by 17th century clockmaker Jacob Mayer, and other pieces by him have turned up in the Royal Collection. And this particular clock that she sourced in her lifetime sold for £74,000 in 2014. So that's in now 21st century money. Back in the day, she was a woman of impeccable taste. Another thing as well that she was connected to was the Giant's Ring in Belfast, which is a big earthwork, roughly about 200 metres across, and it's an example of a henge monument from the Neolithic period. And right in the middle there, you can probably just about make it out in the circle, is a little collection of stones, which we think is probably the tomb of some prehistoric person. And she visited this monument in 1856 because it was on her husband's land, and they actually put a little plaque into the monument itself, celebrating her visit in 1856. I mean, she died in 1880. I mean, I don't know if she ever went back, but she's now her name is now part of the ongoing history of this particular site, which we think was probably made to commemorate funeral practices, or perhaps it's like a gathering area for the prehistoric, the Neolithic people. So she's part of this kind of weird, well, not weird, this kind of archaeological bit of fascination in Northern Ireland, which is just, you know what, and she's in a catacomb on a shelf, almost forgotten, in Brompton, which just the duality of it, I absolutely adore. Another one I'll briefly mention, who's also photographed by Camille Sylvie, is another lady buried in the in the public vault of Brompton Cemetery's catacombs, and this is a lady by the name of Augusta Mary. I'm going to try and pronounce that. Giabili. Her maiden name was Main. I can certainly say that. I don't know anything about her. I was just going through the photos. Oh, I recognise that name. Oh, she's there as well. Maybe they knew each other. I have no idea. But you can see here, she's presenting herself as a respectable Victorian woman. Although, interestingly, with her, she was actually just a milliner. She wasn't particularly upper class. She lived in Golden Square in Soho. And her son and her husband, who died in 1860, was buried in the same public vault. Her son, Theodore, the only thing I can find out about him is in 1851, he stole a lot of door knockers. That's it. That's the only thing I can find about him in this historical record. There must be more, surely, but that's the only thing I can find. God knows how she would have reacted to that, but there we go. Another bit that I'll just briefly mention as well when we're down in the catacombs is the histories that we don't particularly like to see, and that's the smaller coffins, the coffins of the children. And this is a particularly notable one because it's also still got the ceramic flowers that were placed at the coffin on the time of the person's funeral. And this is the little coffin of Arthur Leon de Chalais Lagenstein. I think he was German, from what I can actually work out. And he was he died in 1887. He was only a couple of months old, and I can find nothing else about his family at all. Likely his father was a guy called Carl, who in the 1881 census was a barman. Now, how a barman 6 years later can afford a catacomb in Brompton Cemetery, I have absolutely no idea. Maybe he got a very rapid promotion, perhaps ran his own hotel or something, I don't know. The trail for him goes cold after 1881. But it's just so sad to think he's the only one of his family that's there. The rest of the family obviously moved on and never kind of thought to kind of come back and take him with us, which a number of Victorian families did. Periodically, as I said, families would move either abroad or go to other parts of the UK, like Brighton or something, and they'd take the coffins with them because they wanted the dead to be part of their family, even though they were dead. And it's also just lovely to see these little like tokens. And you see it a lot with the children's coffins. And again, I'll just briefly mention as well another example, which is in the northeast catacomb. And again, it's another singular vault. And this is for the William Wynns. And this is on about tier 5, I believe. And if you look over on the left-hand side, you can see a collection of clearly children's coffins. You can just about make it, there's 3 coffins in that particular loculi. And at the back, there's a coffin which has actually been put on blocks because they obviously don't want that coffin to be obscured. Whenever they paid a visit to it, they wanted everyone to kind of have equal kind of viewing. Obviously, I dare say because they wanted everyone, even the dead, to feel like they were equal in that kind of sense of regard. But the William Wynns, we've got the brown one on the left-hand side with the remains of a wreath on top, is Hester Even Marion William Wynn, and she died at a very, very young age of 5.5 in 1856. Next to her is George Brewis, who died at the age of only 5 days old in 1885. And at the back, you've got Henry Bertie William Wynn, who was 8 months old. The family are buried in other catacombs in the cemetery. They weren't just exclusively buried there. I think their mum, Marion, is in the southwest catacomb. But the William Wynns were a very formidable 19th century political family. Henry Watkins William Wynn, their grandfather, was a very notable British politician. And their dad, Bertie, I'll get to in a moment. Again, I'll say why he's kind of prominent, not for the reasons that you would probably want to be prominent for, really, but if you're ever in Brompton, you see those little coffins, now you know who they are. And this is one of the things as well, we see the names, but we can't put the names to lives, to actual people who they used to be. That's their grandfather, if you just want to know what he looks like. So vaults no more. What happened? Why did the catacombs ultimately fail? Well, they were never massively popular to begin with. A lot of people saw them as frankly far too continental. And frankly, by the late 1880s, you're looking at about 4 or 5 burials in 4 or 5 placements in them a year. They weren't financially very, profitable. So by 1890, a plan is put forward to shut them completely. No more placements in them whatsoever. We're not going to sell them as part of the active range with which the cemetery offers burial options on. So by July 1890, a Home Office resolution is passed where the catacombs are essentially shut. That doesn't apply if you've already bought a space and want to use it. But by that point, the cemetery were actively promoting people to trade in their catacomb space for a grave space. If you didn't want the grave space and you were absolutely dead certain on being put in the catacombs, then fine, that's what would happen. But in terms of actually actively advertising these spaces as active parts of the cemetery, no more. So 1890, it essentially shuts down. But they continue. Kind of trickle of coffins going right up until 1915. But I dare say the reason why they decided to actually get a Home Office injunction to shut them down probably comes down to reasons of basic hygiene and sanitation. And I say this in the case of George Robert Forsyth, no relation to Bruce, from what I can work out. He died in 1883, and he was placed in the Bell Tower Catacomb on the Tier 7, the floor level. And in 1905, it had found that his coffin had burst. And this was something that happened not often, but it did happen. If you think about it, you've got a coffin which has been triple lined. So you've got the wooden inner shell, you've got the lead outer shell, and then you've got the wooden presentation shell, which is usually covered in velvet or nice fancy silver studs or what have you. And sometimes, you've got a body that's decomposing, and it produces gas, and sometimes the metal falters. And so in this particular instance, his coffin ruptured. And so I went to the National Archives the other week to find out more about this, and there is a lot of toing and froing about the cemetery trying to manage what the hell to do with this, because the family can't be traced. He was a travelling salesman. He died at the age of 78. He died in an address in Canterbury, and all his affairs were administered by his great nephew. And they couldn't track him. They couldn't track the family down. So the cemetery went to the undertakers, going, right, well, here you go. See if you can fix it. The undertaker didn't want to know. So eventually what they did is that they buried him in the floor of the catacomb, primarily because they had to deal with the smell, but also they had to deal with the fact they couldn't have exposed human remains just out and about. It just wasn't on. So as a result, going forward of that, this became the default practice. If a coffin was to rupture or to burst, then if they didn't have the up-to-date details of the next of kin, they would just bury them in the floor and have done with it. Now, as far as I can tell, he's the only one that has happened to since. There was another one, Bertie Williams Wynne, the little baby coffins I just told you about. He burst as well. Not the nicest things to be talking about, but this is operationally what would happen with a catacomb. The family was sourced, and they found that they used the wrong kind of metal. They used a zinc coffin instead of a lead one. Why, I don't know. They kind of did the repairs. They put it all back together. Then they sealed him off, and that was that. But I think also the cemetery, which by this point was beginning to find the financial strain a little bit too much, they thought, no, let's just call it quits. This is silly. We can't be doing this. And so they then decided to close them down completely. And that's basically the end of the catacombs as the working part of the cemetery. Just an addendum as well, the colonnades I told you about, where the memorials were supposed to be housed for all the people in the vaults beneath, that structurally was knackered by the early 1900s. The build quality was not fantastic. So by 1904, 30 foot of it actually collapses and falls down. The cemetery, by this point, really quite short of money, are going, well, should we just flatten it then? Let's just get rid of the whole thing. Thankfully, they did. Can you imagine if they got rid of the colonnades? Goodness me, that would have been absolutely awful. They got a firm in from Clapham to eventually do the repair work that was necessary. But blimey, how that would have been awful if we lost them. But that's basically it, as a kind of like a little addendum to the video series that I did, and some of the additional histories that you can find down there. By all means, there are 597 people in those catacombs. I've sort of spoken about, barely 7. There's loads more history that we can find. So I now open the floor to questions if you have them. I can't see the chat function because of the way that Microsoft Teams works, sadly. But if you've got any questions, please raise a hand. Laura will kind of manage questions, and yeah, we'll just take it from there. fire away.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. Yeah, if anybody does want to ask a question, like unmute and ask a question, just let me know in the chat or raise your hand using the little chat, like the little icon thing. We've had a couple, Sheldon. Was there a difference in price or eligibility for the different shelf heights within the catacomb, within the vault?
Good question. No, there was not. It was basically down to the vault that you were in and how many graves that you wanted, or graves, how many loculi you wanted to purchase. So I've got the, hang on, let me just consult my notes because I did actually write it down because I suspected someone would ask. So yeah, so it depends where it was. So let's say belt uplit, £14, as I said. If you wanted to buy 2, that rose to £28. If you wanted to buy 3, that rose to £36. I think there was a slight discount the more that you bought, but no one ever bought more than 4. No one ever bought more than 4. The prices went all the way up to 10. No one did. No one did. It was a ridiculous amount of money for the time. So yeah, no one did. It was just very much a case of, you know, if you wanted to have the Western Catacomb as a all right catacomb, I guess, or the Great Circle where you be Lady, you know, Dugganow or what have you. So yeah, it varied.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sheldon. Yik-Ting, do you have a question? Do you want to unmute and ask it?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go for it.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I've just got 2 questions. First question, I was just wondering if the sort of plaque on the front is gone and like the records are sort of in a mess. What sort of process do you go through to try and figure out who's actually in the coffin? Could you use some sort of like DNA technology to figure out who's in there?
Well, I mean, to physically do anything in those coffins, you would need to get permission from the government. You could not literally just, as tempting as it might be, you couldn't just open them up and just extract DNA. You'd have to get permission from the living descendants if there are any, and that's, you know, consider just doing that for one if you wanted to. I mean, it just isn't practical. You can't do it. You can't do it. So we have to. I think a lot of it is a case of, I hate to use the term guesswork, but a lot of it is making educated guesses. So in that vault that I showed you, I'm trying to work out where they are in relation to the fact that the records are a complete mess. Most of them actually have like little coffin plates that tell you the bare, you know, bit minimum that you need. The rest of it, I think in some cases we'll never know. We'll never know because either the nameplate's gone or it was never listed. And yeah, so it's tricky, but we just have to make the most of it. And now we're putting this history together. We're doing more now than that's been done in years. So at least we're trying to address the issue. We might not be completely successful, but we're trying to address the issue of actually trying to put these names to lives once more.
Great, thanks, Sheldon. Was that it, Yik-Ting, or did you have another one as well?
Yeah, thank you for the answer. I was just wondering, another question was, did you find any, like, I don't know, you call them like grave goods, like something like with Egyptian like pharaohs, they would like have a lot of other things they sort of bury with them. So did you find those sort of things in the catacombs as well?
Not the only thing that they're really. I mean, there's an occasional prayer book, but it's mainly reeds. There's in one of the bell towers. There's a little candle holder. I don't know if that's contemporary with the coffin that it's next to. It might have been added later. I've got no idea. But if they were buried, they're probably sealed away in the coffin, and we certainly never know about it because we're certainly not going to go doing a time team and opening them up and seeing what's what. Knowledge of the family at the time who put the stuff in there, and you know, in that sense, if that's what they've done, let's say they buried them with like their little teddy bear or perhaps like a favourite coin, then actually, do you know what? I don't think we should know everything. I think I think it's good that we don't know everything in regards to the process that went into giving that person their final journey a little bit of dignity. So, in terms of outside the coffin, yeah, it's mainly floral reeds and the remains of that you'll find in the catacombs themselves.
Brilliant, thanks, Sheldon. That kind of leads on nicely to, firstly, you said earlier you weren't sure about the bell. Somebody's actually said that Angela's put that she thinks the bell is superstition, legend to guard against being buried alive. You ring the bell to be rescued if you have found yourself in that situation. So that's just quite interesting there. And then JP has asked, did the Did the catacombs suffer from grave robbers?
Haha,
Do you know?
good question. Very good question. So, that was another added bit of the catacombs. It was protection against grave robbers. You see those gates. I mean, it would be very, very difficult for grave robbers to, number one, break in, and the number two, try and get into a triple line coffin, and then taking body out in the middle of an operational cemetery. It just would not work. That's not to say that it didn't happen, though. One incident in the 1940s where some little scalawags broke in and made merry. And yeah, so again, you go into the British Newspaper Archive, the stories are about it there. No contemporary grave robbing happened when the cemetery was operational, but some little toe rags in the 1940s managed it. That's it.
Fair enough. JP had another question as well. So you talked about the prices being for a slot, and you kind of covered this a little bit with the coffins with the children in. But could you put more than one coffin in a slot? Like, was that quite commonplace, or was it restricted to children, or?
It was mainly restricted to children because, particularly once you've got a full size coffin which weighs several tons, there's not really much you can do. I mean, there's stories in the, so there was one, I made a note of it. There were two coffins together in what's packaged into one coffin in the Western Catacomb. That was John and Frederick O'Neill in June 1859. They were two little babies. But in terms of full size coffins, you couldn't put two into one space. There just wasn't the room. Although obviously with children's coffins, because they're smaller, you could do what the William Wynns did, and then basically put three in the space of one to save space and money, I assume. So, but by and large, it's one slot, one coffin, because you wouldn't be able to get much more in.
Fantastic, thank you. And a couple more things about the actual catacombs themselves. So, what are the floors made of? Are they soil, or is it boarded? Are there or stoned, like slabs?
Yeah, so obviously the catacombs as they are, and you might have seen the videos and the little snippets I've shown in this presentation, they seem quite run down. So as far as I can tell, they've only ever been soil. As far as I can tell, they might have had some sort of very fine gravel at one point. The walls would have been whitewashed, so it would have looked quite pucker, frankly. And then obviously the coffins in red velvet and blue and black, it would look quite well designed. But nowadays, yeah, it's mainly just dirt. It's had nearly over 100 years of non-use and accumulation of dirt blowing in and stuff dripping down from the roof and stuff. So if there was any kind of floor covering, it's probably buried beneath the detritus of years of just being mothballed, essentially.
Fair enough. But an interesting question from John. You said large areas of the catacombs were sealed off. Is it possible that some of them were never built?
Yes, it's entirely possible that they were never built. Just looking at the overall structure of them, though, I mean, probably what's happened is that they've probably built the basic framework and then they've just basically decked out the bits that were actually going to be used, I would assume. I mean, short of actually, taking down the walls and seeing if there is actually vaults behind the bricked up walls, we'll never know. But certainly on the official schematics, it follows the plan of what we see in terms of where the coffins are. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was some rudimentary preparations for additional space should it be needed, I'd have said.
Great, thank you. Helen, if you've got a question, do you want to unmute and ask it?
Yeah, hi Sheldon. It's Helen Jerome here. I just wondered, what's the most shocking or surprising thing you came across when you were in there?
Good question, Helen. I won't talk about it too much, but let's say one of the coffins is not as it should be. That's all I'm saying. I will not elaborate on it further because I don't want to encourage things. But yeah, it was oh, yeah. So, but then in terms of the quality with which the catacombs are in, they're actually in pretty good nick. If you go to Highgate, for example, there's a reason why they don't let you walk around those free range. Yeah, in the 60s, all sorts went on. No. But Brompton's in pretty good nick. But occasionally, damage, wear and tear, things happen. So, yeah.
That ties in with Sandy as well. They've asked, what does it smell like in there?
Didn't smell of anything. I mean, we did some filming and it rained really heavy. It was a bit musty, but nothing. It's not as if there's no smell of like death or decay or anything like that. Occasional earthy smell, but there's no. I think if there was anything nasty that was lingering, it's long since rotted away or got kind of been dealt with. But no, it's just fine. Yeah, yeah.
It's quite airy, really, isn't it? Because
It's
like
airy. Although I'll say, if you ever get a chance to go to the Highgate Catacombs, there's actually a breeze because they actually engineered a breeze to actually waft through because they were so terrified of smells. So even if you go there to this day, it's like, this is like air conditioned. It's not. It's just Victorian engineering. It's great. It's great.
do we know what happened to the Western and the public catacombs?
Good question. So they were bombed in the war. We know that, but. So there's supposed to be X amount of coffins there, and there aren't, and we're not entirely sure why. I suspect what probably happened is that as the cemetery began to wound down, and again because this issue they had with the catacombs of coffins occasionally bursting and so on, I think they probably had a bit of a clear out, not a clear out, but they just buried a lot of the coffins on site somewhere. I'm not entirely sure where, but whatever's left of that western edge of the catacombs, there was a heritage project going on recently where they were going to, I think, make a columbarium of them. I'm not sure if that's much of a go anymore. But the actual structure itself is more or less intact. But yeah, this is one of the reasons why this project's going on, is that we're trying to reacquaint ourselves with this history because there are questions. A lot of, never mind knowing who's there and who's not there. Operationally, like stuff like how did the coffins get pushed up into the upper tiers? You can't expect men to just carry them. I mean, these things weigh tons. How operationally, how did it work? So it's part of an ongoing project, just trying to reacquaint ourselves with how a functioning cemetery with a catacomb would have worked, and like what happens to the Western catacombs ongoing. We'll find out. We'll see.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sheldon. We're nearly there, I think. Sonia hilariously says she thinks her Amazon Alexa is listening because it's just suggested a recipe for bone broth.
Oh, Lord.
Dark. We love a bit of dark. And I think a nice question to maybe end on, but if you do have more, do feel free to pop them in the chat.
Yeah,
Christina has said she'd love to know generally what your favourite cemetery that you visited is, and what cemetery would you like to visit the most?
Oh, well, Brompton's up there, obviously. I'd say my absolute top favourite is obviously because I've got access to the catacombs. I mean, why wouldn't it be my favourite? I'd say Brighton Extramural, lovely, gorgeous. Whenever this is one thing that annoys me about. So whenever you see these timeout lists of all top 10 cemeteries, Brighton Extramural never gets a look in, never gets mentioned. So it was Highgate, Kensal Green, West Norwood, yeah, great, yeah, fascinating places. Go to Brighton Extramural. If you're ever in Brighton, go there and you'll see what I mean. It's glorious, absolutely beautiful, love it.
Thank you. And then Angela's asked, she knows it's full of bodies, but do you ever feel like you are not alone down in the catacombs? Yesterday he was with me, so he definitely.
I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in stone tape theory, which is a very good 1970s or 1980s. I can't remember. It's a TV show. I don't believe in spectres and orbs and all that kind of stuff per se. Personally, that's my own personal belief. So as a result of that, I just go down and I'm, again, the cemetery manager can ascertain when we open the gates. The first thing I say is, "Hello, everyone." It might sound bonkers, but I think it's just basic manners, frankly. I mean, you're going to a place that was only ever meant to be a private space. It wasn't as if any visitor of the cemetery could just waltz in and just have a look. This was for a very select number of people, and that's a privilege. It's a privilege to go down into these spaces and see these coffins and see these bars and these grates, and to spend time in these physical spaces. And I think we should be mindful of that. And so I just I say hello, but I don't. It's not as if I'm expecting Sophia Countess Dugganow to suddenly apparate in front of me and go, "Hello, do you fancy an Aperol?" That's not how I that's not how I kind of see it. but yeah, you just go down and it's there. It's like a library. It's literally just walking into a library, if anything.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheldon. We have come to the end of our talk. We do have another question though, so I will say that people can leave if they want, but Sonia, if you want to hang around, we'll ask Sheldon your question in a second. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. Thank you so much to you, Sheldon. It's so interesting and it's so exciting that there is somebody who is so interested and can share that information with us, both about Brompton and the catacombs, but also the cemeteries in general. The talks are all free, but we are a charity, so if you have enjoyed tonight's talk and you'd like to make a donation, we'd be really grateful. We've also got more Winter Warmer talks coming up in the new year, which will be free to attend, so please do check them out. And we have walks and talks that go on all the time as well, so there's links to those in the chat. But thank you so much for coming, everyone, and and all the best for the festive season in the new year to you all as well. I'll see you in January. Sheldon, if you don't mind staying long, we have had a few more questions. Is that all right? Thank you. Lots of thanks in the chat. So
if anyone has to pop off, then thank you so much for enjoying the talk. If you want to stick around, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. But thank you so much for coming along and indulging in my passion and sharing some remarkable histories in a very hidden part of the cemetery. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Sonia says, have you been to cemeteries abroad just to sightsee the differences? And if so, what ones have you seen? Are there any memorable ones?
Yes, sadly, every time we go abroad, I do make it a point of order to go to a cemetery, despite my poor boyfriend wanting to go. Oh, do we have to? Well, yeah, well, we bloody do. So I've been to Bordeaux cemetery, gorgeous. Where else is there? There's when I was in DC, I went to Arlington. And a couple of the military ones around there. I've been to Père Lachaise. Oh god, where else have I been? I mainly keep it British, but I mainly keep it like local, really, if anything, because that's obviously travel's not really much of a thing at the moment, is it really? But yeah, I've been to I'd say Père Lachaise, obviously. Oh goodness me, wonderful, beautiful place, love it. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. What was the name of the Brighton one you recorded or record?
Oh yeah, so Brighton Extra Mural. I call it a 2-for-1 because it's part of another cemetery called Woodvale. But Brighton Extra Mural is I call it Highgate on Sea. If you've ever been to Highgate Cemetery, it's basically Highgate but on the seaside. It's great. I sometimes go there on my own for picnics. Oh, honestly, love it. Beautiful space. Beautiful space.
Brilliant. I think that's it, Sheldon, actually. There's a few comments in the chat, like lots of thanks, like I've said. Pip Patrick saying, I have a soft spot for the necropolis in Glasgow. And then lots of people just saying, thank you. This has been brilliant. So, and someone's looking forward to finding your YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, Cemetery Club. Have a look. I'm not much on it recently, but it is there. So have a look.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sheldon. I think that's it in the chat. But yeah, amazing. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone here did, and everyone who was here earlier definitely did as well. So, and yeah, again, lots of brilliant thank yous in the chat. So thank you. I think we'll end it there and let you go and have your dinner. And I'm pretty sure everyone's sick of hearing my boyfriend cough in the background as well. So bless him. So he's like trying to choke it down. But thank you so much. Thanks for coming.